Before I start, I want to emphasize the following disclaimer, something we at USDA are required to do. The views expressed are mine and they do not necessarily represent those of the Economic Research Service or the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I think I'll use this. I'm going to, for this presentation, cover four broad objectives. I'm going to discuss the current status of U.S. irrigated agriculture, how important irrigation is to U.S. agriculture, where it occurs, and what it produces. I'm going to review several water demand supply challenges facing U.S. irrigated agriculture in the face of some emerging demands and expected climate change impacts. I'm going to talk about what these changes mean in terms of the challenge for agricultural water conservation itself, including just how efficient U.S. irrigated agriculture is as of 2008, the latest data available. I'm going to, also in terms of the appropriate roles for on-farm and watershed level conservation perspectives. I'll wind up by summarizing, emphasizing what it likely takes to encourage a more sustainable irrigated agriculture sector in the face of the emerging demands and expected climate change impacts. This will involve highlighting the need to pursue a broader conservation policy perspective, particularly for USDA, and I'll get into the details of that a little later. We'll first talk about the traditional water demands, particularly between agriculture and non-agricultural uses. This is a graph that acquired from the U.S. Geological Survey, their water use estimates by sector. It tracks a revealing story on the increases in water demands from traditional sources from 1950 to 2005. Again, the latest data available. They haven't come out with their 2010 estimate report yet. Here it shows that irrigated agriculture and the thermoelectric power sector are the traditionally dominant sources for water demands across the country. However, it does need to be remembered that for 98% of withdrawals for thermoelectric cooling systems generally do return to their source of origin. Withdrawals for irrigated agriculture were at about 143 million acre-feet in 2005. They accounted for about 31% of the nation's total. They, however, increased 43% from 1950, but then declined 15% from their peak in 1980. It also needs to be remembered that irrigated agriculture actually accounts for about 80+% of actual consumptive water use in the United States. Irrigation water withdrawals for the 17 western states in 2005 were about 122 million acre-feet. They accounted for about 64% of total withdrawals throughout the West. In the western states, irrigated agriculture accounts for about 58% of surface water withdrawals. They account also for 79% of groundwater withdrawals. Also in the western states, relative to total irrigation water use, about 52% originates from surface water sources, and about 49% is pumped from local and regional aquifers. Let's look at how important irrigation is to U.S. agriculture. Based on the latest U.S. Ag Census data for 2012, just released about a month ago, irrigated farms accounted for $152.4 billion in market sales of agricultural products. They account for about 39% of total sales of all agricultural products across the U.S. Average per farm value of agricultural products sold in 2012 for all farms was about $187,000 per farm. For non-irrigated dryland farms, the average value of agricultural products sold was about $134,000. Irrigated farms, however, their average value of products sold was $514,000, which is about 2.7 times the average for all farms and about 3.9 times the average for dryland farms. It needs to be remembered, however, that irrigation also makes a significant contribution to the value of livestock and poultry production, which is generally not measured, and they do so through irrigated crop products actually used as animal forage and feed. Where does crop irrigation occur, and how has it changed over time? In 2012, 55.8 million farmland acres were irrigated in the United States. 52.1 million acres of harvested cropland, about 16.5% of U.S. total harvested cropland acres. And then also 3.7 million acres of pasture land, which accounted about 0.8% of U.S. pasture land acres. However, as you can see from the map, nearly 72.5% of U.S. irrigated acres were irrigated in the 17 contiguous western states. They accounted for about 40.5 million acres irrigated. Again, the majority, 37.1 million of those cropland acres were cropland acres, and then 3.4 million of those acres were pastureland acres. However, irrigated agriculture and water use are not static. Between the 2002 Census of Agriculture and the 2007 Census of Agriculture, there was a net increase of nearly 1.3 million acres irrigated across the U.S. Nebraska accounted for nearly 1 million of those acres, actually 800,000, during that 2002-07 period, with the remainder of the increase occurring in the Delta and Southeast regions. California and Florida led the states where irrigated acres during this time period actually declined, 700,000 acres in California and 300,000 acres in Florida. From the 2007 census to the 2012 Ag Census, irrigated acres had a net decline of 777,000 acres across the U.S. The larger decreases occurred in Texas, 500,000 acres, Colorado, 350,000, Nebraska, about 260,000, whereas the previous time period, Nebraska had a 800,000 acre increase. Since then, in 2012, it had a 262,000 acre decrease. This was done in 2000. This was done for the 2012 production year, and it had a serious drought in there, and there was a lot of irrigation that had to actually quit because the pumping capacities couldn't match the water need.
In California, but not Florida?
Well, in California they have had a continuous decline. Their long-term drought situation and just less water total available in California. But most of it in Nebraska is heavy groundwater. Yeah, they've been having a steady decline in acres, and I would suspect that there's less and less surface water available. It's being reallocated basically to urban centers. The larger gains occurred in Arkansas, nearly 350,000 acres. Mississippi, 283,000 acres. Louisiana, 139,000. Kansas, 118, and Georgia, 107. So the Delta and Southeast do have some increases. That's where the major increases have been occurring. As this figure indicates, there are 12 leading irrigation states that account for about 76% of all irrigated acres. And they go around the circle with Nebraska at the top. Nebraska's 8.3 million irrigated acres led all other states, followed by California with still at 7.9 million. And then interestingly, Arkansas with 4.8 million acres, and then followed by Texas with 4.5 million acres. And I say interestingly because in the previous census, Texas was ahead of Arkansas. Arkansas, with the latest census, 2012 census, has now surpassed Texas. 3 eastern states, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Florida, are still among the 12 leading irrigation states. Previously, in 2007, only Arkansas and Florida were among the 12 leading states. Clearly, by 2012, the gains in Georgia, as previously mentioned, the Delta and the Southeast continue to increase in relative importance of overall irrigated agriculture across the U.S. What does irrigation produce? Irrigated agriculture actually accounts for a share of harvested acreage for most crops produced across the U.S. This figure illustrates the relative distribution of 2012 harvested irrigated acreage separately for the 17 western states and then for the 31 eastern states by crop category, major crop category. Corn for grain and forage crops, which include hay, haylage, grass silage, and green chop, account for the larger share, actually 49%, of all harvested irrigated crop acres in the western states. Wheat, soybeans, orchards, and vegetables are the second larger group of irrigated crops in the West. They range from 7% for vegetables to 9.8% for orchards. In the eastern states, corn for grain and soybeans account for the largest share, actually 53 or 54% of all harvested irrigated crop acres in the east. Rice, cotton, and vegetables are the second larger group in the east, ranging from 9.8% for cotton and about 11.3% or 13% for rice. Relative to the western states, the irrigated cropping pattern for the eastern states reflect a smaller share of acreage for forage crops and wheat, and an increased share of irrigated acres devoted to rice, soybeans, and vegetables. Skip a minute. Not sure which one this is on. Okay, there we go. While it's recognized that irrigation is important and does make a significant contribution to U.S. agriculture, it is also well recognized that the water demand supply situation for irrigated agriculture is not expected to remain the same. The sector is facing new challenges. There are growing emerging demands and expected supply changes that are a significant cause for concern as a motivation for a conserving and sustainable sector. Growing competing water demands and increased scarcity arise from 4 primary sources. 1, potential realization of Native American water right claims. 2, an expanding in-stream environmental flow concept that has been occurring, particularly throughout the West. 3, water for an expanding energy sector. And 4, the potential for supply-demand changes associated with expected climate change impacts. I can't go into the details, great details of a lot of this. I do have a lot more detail for these in the report that I had on listed at the initial, and I'll also list this report at the end. But I will cover a few facts in each one of them. With respect to Native American water right claims, the reserved water rights, these reserved water rights were established in 1908 with the U.S. Supreme Court Winners versus U.S. decision. Many reservation water right claims are currently under negotiation or do remain unresolved in settlement disputes or in judicial proceedings, but they have been estimated in 1984 by the Western States Water Council to be equivalent in 1984, as they were estimated, to about 46 million acre feet annually. Now, if you remember earlier, I had to show the graph where the Western states use about 122 million acre feet of water. Okay, this estimate, which is long and it's old, but it's the only one that exists, they were estimated in 1984 to be equivalent to about 46 million acre-feet. No small amount of water. In addition, the U.S. Supreme Court in Capri versus U.S. in 1976 actually opened the door for Indian reserved water rights to apply to groundwater. There's a number of journal articles that review this. But since then, there really has been no definitive decision on these rights, but some states do recognize them. With respect to water for in-stream or environmental flows, over time, changing social values have broadened the concept of beneficial use, particularly for surface waters. The concept has transitioned from an initial out-of-stream development concept quite some time ago to a concept of minimum in-stream flow, and then more recently, and in more recent times, to an environmental ecosystem habitat flow concept. Environmental flow benefits are generally defined to include flows for enhanced filtration, dilution of sewage and other effluents, fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, hydropower, navigation, groundwater recharge, wetlands and migratory bird habitat, exotic species control, and yes, even local regional economic development. There are a number of authors, but a key one that you should become aware of was an article, a journal article written by Lawrence McDonnell, an attorney, and it's published in the Wyoming Law Review in 2009, which actually does a good job of defining this new concept of in-stream environmental flows. Back in 1998, Landry wrote an article and it's published in the Journal of Water Policy, and he actually estimated that from 1990 to 97, 2.4 million acre-feet of water was leased, purchased, or donated to enhance river flows in the western states. That actually represented about 5.2% of the 1998 applied surface water to irrigated agriculture. So again, as this concept expands and has been expanding, that's an emerging demand for a very scarce water resource in the western states. For the energy sector, growth across the U.S. is also expected to significantly increase the demand for water resources. This source involves growth from multiple energy sectors, as the list indicates. Water demand for growth in the biofuel energy sector is a good example to illustrate the growth in this sector. For biofuel processing itself, aggregate water demands is expected to be comparatively low, but obviously local impacts are likely to be much more sizable. The larger demand comes from, however, irrigated feedstock production. Water demands there are expected to be much more significant. Chow et al. In an Environmental Science and Technology 2009 report estimated that from 2005 to 2008, total consumptive water use for bioethanol in the U.S. increased 246%, from 1.5 million acre-feet to about 5 million acre-feet in a very short period of time. The National Research Council in a 2008 report estimated that irrigated corn requires 780 gallons of withdrawals per gallon of ethanol. They made this estimate for ethanol plants in Nebraska. In 2009, the U.S. General Accounting Office estimated that average water consumed in corn ethanol production is about 324 gallons per gallon of ethanol. Again, they made this estimate for ethanol plants in the Northern Plains. Now, there exists a lot more information for the total energy sector on this. I can't review them all. Again, the report that I referred to, and then I'll refer to at the end, it's an economic information report written by myself and my co-author, Marcel Ailery. That report provides a lot more detailed information on the sector. I'll provide that website at the end. You can go to that for more reference. It must be remembered, however, that for most energy development, in the most literature that I've read, it's widely held that water quality and environmental impacts are potentially looked at as being the more significant policy concern. Now, with respect to the last emerging demand, climate change impacts. They're also expected to alter the water supply demand conditions throughout, my references and my comments are going to focus on expectations for the western states. In the West, U.S. climate change forecasts are expected to alter the quantity and timing of stream flows, resulting in more runoff occurring in early spring, reducing quantities for reservoir storage, and reducing supplies available to meet summer and fall peak irrigation water requirements. Studies conducted for the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicate, one, that declines in April snowfall, April snow water equivalent snow cover are expected to decline by 15 to 30% since 1950 in the western mountains of North America. They also estimate declines in stream flow by 2% per decade over the last century for the central Rocky Mountain region. For the upper Colorado River Basin, decreases in runoff and stream flow by the latter 21st century have been estimated ranging from 10 to 45%. This is a number of authors that have done this: Christensen and Lettenmeyer in a 2006 report, Horling and Eidenscheid in a 2007 report, and McCabe and Woloch in a 2007 journal article. The December 2012 Bureau of Reclamation report or study, called the Colorado River Basin Water Supply Demand Study, they projected a 9% decrease in mean natural flow at Lee's Ferry over the next 50 years, and a long-term imbalance in future basin supply and demand of about 3.2 million acre-feet by 2060. In addition, aquifer recharge rates are also expected to decline. For the Ogallala Aquifer, groundwater recharge is expected to decrease by more than 20% if temperatures increase by 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, or equivalent 2.4 degrees Celsius. This was reported by the IPCC report of 2007. In addition, for the Ellensburg Basin, which is part of the Columbia Basin Plateau, aquifer recharge is estimated to decline by 25%, and that estimate was made by the National Water Association Group report published in 2000. Increased water demands and supply impacts due to climate change present a new challenge for agricultural water conservation. There are actually two perspectives to this challenge, consisting of both on-farm, which I consider part one, and watershed scale conservation, which I'll consider as part two. Warming temperatures are expected to increase crop evapotranspiration, ET, and generally reduce ET efficiency, i.e. yield per unit of ET, causing differential shifts in regional crop irrigation water demands. This is also reported and supported by the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, which produced a report in 2008. With rising temperatures, it is expected that existing irrigation systems will likely become less efficient. The changes taking place with both water demand and supply actually underscore the importance of the timing and quantity or in-field management of irrigation applications. Both the adaptability and sustainability of irrigated agriculture will likely depend on more extensive adoption of higher efficient irrigation production systems, as opposed to irrigation application systems, which is a traditional view. That is an emphasis on much more effectively combining efficient irrigation application systems with more intensive in-field water management practices, where these practices can consist of more extensive and intensive use of soil and plant moisture sensing devices, commercial irrigation scheduling services, computer-based crop growth simulation models, use of tailwater pits and laser-level fields, reduced irrigation set times, shortening of furrow lengths, and also alternative row irrigation techniques. The question is, why are integrated irrigation production systems more important and will be more important in the future? These systems actually are known to improve the ability of producers to decide when to irrigate and how much water to apply by crop growth stage. They allow producers to either apply water closer to the crop's consumptive use requirement or to actually deficit irrigate, i.e. apply less than the full ET crop requirement. Deficit irrigation increases real water savings while allowing producers to actually maximize overall farm economic returns through reduced system losses and manage reductions in crop consumptive use, i.e. you deficit irrigate, you back off the full ET yield, you accept some yield loss, but you also incur some benefits from reduced pumping costs. In a world of increasing competition for water resources, particularly with potentially significant emerging demands, enhancing the sustainability of irrigated agriculture will actually depend upon improving irrigation, the efficiency of irrigated agriculture. However, understanding the potential for improving on-farm irrigation efficiency requires an understanding of the current relative efficiency of irrigated agriculture. That is, how efficient is irrigated agriculture? The evidence in this graph is for the western states. I've got it for the eastern states, but the western states is more revealing. This figure evaluates irrigation efficiency from the perspective of the relative share of irrigated acres being irrigated with more efficient systems, separately for pressure sprinkler systems and for gravity irrigation systems. Now, most people know that the traditional definition of on-farm irrigation efficiency is consumptive use relative to applied water. The problem with that is we don't have any data to do that unless we have a very site-specific study and we go out and collect it. There's no national level data that is available to do that. How do we do it? Well, we look at the relative share. We have plenty of data on the improved efficiency of all kinds of systems. And we track these systems through the Farm and Ranch Irrigation Survey. And that's where this graph is developed from. And basically grouping that data by the more efficient systems and determining their relative shares. The figure demonstrates that while substantial technological innovation has already occurred in Western irrigated agriculture, there's obviously still room for significant improvement. Over 50% of irrigated acres, as indicated by the yellow bars, continue to be irrigated with traditional gravity and traditional less efficient pressure sprinkler systems. Historical transitions seem to suggest that while Western irrigated agriculture is obviously on a path towards greater sustainability, further progress will likely be needed as water demand and supply conditions continue to change. This is never more dramatically illustrated than in farm use of on-farm water management practices. From USDA's Farm and Ranch Irrigation Survey, which collects this data, that data indicates that producers do not make widespread use of the more efficient in-field water management practices. Fewer than 10% of irrigators make use of soil or plant moisture sensing devices or commercial irrigation scheduling services. And fewer than 2% of irrigators use computer-based simulation models to evaluate irrigation water requirements based on consumptive use water needs by crop growth stage and the use of local weather information. Most irrigators tend to use conventional water management, on-farm water management practices, i.e. they get in the truck and go out to the field, feel the soil. That's their response. Most of them do that. Or they use an irrigation calendar schedule. Or they just watch their neighbor. Do what my neighbor does. Those are the conventional methods of on-farm water management. Now I'd like to shift a little gear and talk about the second challenge for agricultural water conservation. Part two of the challenge for agricultural water conservation is not on-farm, as I talked about previously, and the use of shifting the concept to going to irrigation production systems, but rather a more extensive adoption of a broader public policy perspective for agricultural water conservation. The second component of the challenge is to better integrate on-farm water conservation activities with institutional or watershed scale water management mechanisms. Why is this important? It's important because for a more sustainable future, agricultural water conservation is both a farm and a basin-level resource conservation issue. A watershed-scale conservation perspective involves integrating improved on-farm irrigation efficiency with state and federal watershed water management tools, such as the use of conserved water rights, drought water banks, option water markets, reservoir management, irrigated acreage and groundwater pumping restrictions, and yes, even the irrigated acreage retirement. Why is an integrated conservation institutional perspective important? I believe it's important because integrated water conservation policies allow producers, along with other stakeholders, to more effectively interact using market mechanisms to jointly recognize the values of water across competing demands. In addition, on-farm irrigation efficiency improvements as part of a broader basin-level conservation plan may be combined with other activities, other practices, such as deficit irrigation, acreage idling, off-farm water transfers, that actually reduce crop consumptive water use, while at the same time allowing producers to maximize farm economic returns. This whole perspective is supported by the more recent National Research Council report, 2010 report titled Towards Sustainable Agricultural Systems, and is also supported by USDA's RE&E 2012 Action Plan. Sorry about that, I skipped that. It's one way to move ahead. In addition, sustainable agriculture as a USDA policy goal and as it applies to irrigated agriculture was actually initiated in the 1990 Food, Agriculture, Conservation, and Trade Act with a simple statement, a simple conservation objective, and that is, quote, to protect and enhance America's water resources. First time it was stated there. In addition, USDA's strategic plan for fiscal years 2010 to 2015 highlights the importance of using farm-level, watershed, and institutional measures as strategic means to meet the USDA conservation goals. Since the 2008 Farm Bill, USDA has actually been participating in watershed-scale agricultural water conservation activities through the establishment of federal, state, and local partnership agreements. And this has all been done under the 2008 program called the Agricultural Water Enhancement Program, AWEP. Through the AWEP program, USDA began to integrate on-farm water conservation activities with watershed scale and institutional water management initiatives. Since 2009, USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service has entered into over 100 AWEP partnership agreements across the country. While this was a relatively small program, it was actually a pilot program. Its authorized funding for 2009 to 12 was about $280 million, relatively small USDA program. The AWEP program allowed USDA to enhance its water conservation objectives at a landscape scale, improving upon agriculture's sustainable future while also enhancing the potential for rural agricultural water conservation. However, with the 2014 Farm Bill that was recently passed and signed, AWEP and 3 other conservation programs were repealed. AWEP was repealed, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Program was repealed, the Cooperative Conservation Partnership Program was repealed, and the Great Lakes Basin Program was repealed. It's not all bad news. In their place, a partnership-based watershed-scale water conservation perspective of AWEP was actually adopted within a broader land and water based regional conservation partnership program. Congress liked the program. They got rid of all the previous programs and adopted it for both land and water. The program is USDA's first attempt at adopting a true landscape and institutional scale conservation perspective for both land and water resources. The new Regional Conservation Partnership Program is funded at about $394 million for fiscal years 2014 and 2015. Pretty good increase. And at nearly $1.2 billion for the 5 years of the 2014 Farm Bill. Program funding for this broader water and land conservation perspective is allocated to partnership projects within 3 categories. There are projects in 8 geographic regions. They are referred to as critical conservation areas, and they are chosen by the Secretary of Agriculture. These projects receive 35% of total program funds. Then there are what they call nationwide and multi-state partnership projects. These projects will receive 40% of funding. And finally, the third group is projects within a single state. These are expected to receive about 25% of the program funding. Will this more broadly defined and focused program succeed? I suspect that it will, given that the AWEP program was a success. How well will it succeed? Well, it's just begun. It was announced by the Secretary of Agriculture on May 27, 2014. So they're just beginning, so time is going to tell whether it's going to succeed or not. With that, I'll close. This is my contact information. And as I said, the first item up there is reference to this report. We're pull a lot of the information, and there's more detailed information on the sector-specific water demands, which I couldn't get into a lot of detail. I didn't have the time to do so here. All right. And I think I went way over line. I apologize.
I know we're right up at the end, but if there's a question or two, one of our students has the mic. Do you have questions? I think we're all absorbing information, so I know I am.
Good.
Do we have hopes of meeting the goals? I guess. I mean,
Well, yeah, I guess time will tell. I'm encouraged. I mean, I didn't have any idea that Congress would go this route, but they like the idea of a broader-based conservation perspective, and we've been addressing that issue for quite some time in our research projects and recognized it, but it's going to depend on how the program is implemented. Like I said, since 2009, there was over 100 partnership agreements made across the country, and these partnerships can include anybody and everybody. They can be state level, they can be multi-state level. They include irrigators, communities, and their representatives. They include Native Americans. They include the local minister, if he wants to. And they form and get together and put the proposal together themselves, okay, as to what they want to happen with water resources in a particular watershed. That proposal is sent to NRCS, and they review it and accept or reject it on it. But they've accepted most all of them. So I think a partnership-based conservation program for a watershed that includes the key stakeholders has a much more better chance of success than on actually getting real water that's saved. It's a complete shift from the past. I don't know if you're familiar with EQIP, but EQIP is basically, and has been basically, historically, a give me money for an irrigation system program. Well, that's going away. Yes, they have to go through EQIP, and individual farmers would still have to go through EQIP to make their application, but they have to make it through this partnership agreement. And they have to sign on to the partnership's agreement with NRCS.